or better anyway. I know the feeling. I've been lucky so far. Appreciate your lesson this morning. Very timely. Stealing some of my thunder. Of course, your lessons on church history is also a good parallel, I think, to what I'm trying to cover here. I know one of the main points of your lesson this morning was for us as Christians what our responsibilities are for being active, to react and be proactive to what's going on around us in the world, to defend the gospel. It's not, you can't just defend the gospel by coming in here on Sunday and on Wednesday night Bible study. It's an everyday thing. And it's not just when you're amongst fellow Christians either. It's when you're out in the world with your friends, when you're at work. There's a lot of persecution that goes on for us as Christians as well. When we do what we're commanded to do, of course we were warned that that also would happen. But again, one of those uncanny parallels, when we go out and try and defend our country, our form of government, we also will suffer persecution. Because those that seek to undermine it also realize that it's the underlying foundation of our form of government is God, Christianity in particular. He's mentioned the things that's happened in New York this past week. There's another thing that happened, I believe this was last week or the prior week, that I know most people probably never heard a peep about, but this happened in Battle Creek, Michigan. It was on a college community, the Kellogg Community College. You know, colleges are supposed to be our institutions that help to encourage and promote freedom of thought and ideas. Yet here, there was actual college students that were arrested. Can you imagine what awful thing they were doing on a college campus to get arrested? They were passing out little pocket-sized constitutions and got arrested. Now I don't know how my lesson last week struck anybody as, the importance of the rights that are recognized in our First Amendment.
What did they charge you with?
Well, that's the funny thing. They can arrest you for anything, and it's an intimidation tactic.
Yeah.
I think the charge initially was creating a public disturbance on public property. But our First Amendment, there's 5 liberties that is mentioned in it. And I hope my lesson last week showed how you may be willing to compromise on one of those, thinking that it won't affect the others, but they do. And if you're able to, I'm kind of a person, when I hear something and I knew I didn't know, I'll spend the next week going over it in my mind and mind repeatedly, just for the sake of knowing something. Sometimes I just want to know something just to know it. And that was one of the things when I'd heard the lesson on that topic before, that right offhand I could not name all 5 of them. can now. But can you imagine? I gave you a made-up scenario last week. But can you imagine that, in fact, today, somewhere, maybe not all at once, but there are places where each and every right that's recognized in the First Amendment is suppressed in this country. We all imagine things like that going on somewhere else, but it's always somewhere else. It doesn't affect us till it affects us personally. And the whole point of that lesson was to try and make it personal for y'all. Because just like what we heard, the travesty of what's happened in New York this past week, legally speaking, it's going to be up to us to make a change for our children. I mean, I could have a whole sheet of paper of incidents like that, whether, you can't even go to Dearborn, Michigan and walk down the street with your Bible and try and preach to anybody. You'll be arrested. Because the Muslim community is so strong there, and we know how tolerant they are. The police won't even go to certain areas in that town, except the Muslim police. They've cried for Sharia there. So, for us to come in here on Sundays and feel comfortable that we're not molested here when we worship, doesn't mean if we keep living this way that that's going to stay that way. Just like if we don't go out and preach the word, that we will be able to continue to worship here the way we do. They're both tied together. I believe what we're seeing in New York is a result, not just of people wanting a different form of government, but they're wanting a different form of morality. It's a lack of Christians doing what they're supposed to be doing.
That's right, amen.
But that's us. We could say it's them, but it's us. If we're not doing anything, if we don't, the least we can do is participate in worship and study. But as a Christian, we're commanded to reach other people. And if we don't do as we've commanded, you don't think it's God's providence that He should see fit to give us the type of government that we're seeing it turn into in New York? And it's not just New York. We couldn't have our constitutional republic without our faith. Our founders were adamant about that. But just as Christians suffer persecution, there's two ways that as a Christian we can respond to being persecuted. We can shut up and sit down, or we can stand up. Our Christianity is based on principles, not of our own making, but principles found in here, in particular the New Testament. It requires a particular mindset in each of us that we have to set every morning when we wake up. It's not natural to wake up every day in a good mood, thinking life is grand. I'm going to do everything right today. Nothing's going to trip me up. But if we choose at the start of the day what kind of day we're going to have, what kind of mood we're going to have, we may be sick, we may be ill, we may be handicapped, whatever. Our mindset, even in the worst of circumstances, will dictate how we view and live our day. Well, the same can be said as us as citizens. You know, just as an instance where I was talking about those college kids. They suffered a form of persecution. And they can either do one of two things. They can sit down and shut up, or they can stand up for their rights. Just because the government says you can or cannot do something, does not mean that they control what your rights actually are. Because if they did, we wouldn't need the rights. The government would always do what's right. But our government, our Constitution, was not founded on arbitrary ideas either. They were founded on certain principles. That's why it didn't matter in the beginning. They didn't have parties necessarily like we do today, and it wasn't party versus that party of only two. There ended up being several. But they didn't run on a particular party per se. They did in order to be shown on the ballot. But what they were trying to get elected on was not, well, because I'm in this party. It's because I believe in these principles. And principles don't matter which party. We don't see a principled government right now, because if we saw a principled government, then a principle dictates something is either right or wrong, regardless of who does it. It wouldn't matter if one party does it or the other. They're both expected to suffer the consequences. But when you have a government that ignores one party just because of its party's sake, but then totally goes after the other for doing the exact same thing, that's not principled. And that is not something that can be rectified. In order for us to unify as a nation, we're going to have to go back to the principles that we were founded on, regardless of party. Today, I'm going to start just like what Patrick's been doing with a history of the church. I'm going to start the history that brought us our Constitution. Our Constitution has a family tree. It can also be considered, if it's a tree, and trees have roots. Well, there are certain documents that are considered the roots of that liberty. The genealogy comes from a rich history that was directed by God, no doubt. It's very similar to the rich biblical history that God revealed the events to prepare the way and the time that he said he was going to establish his kingdom on earth. And in Genesis 3:15, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Much later in history, King Nebuchadnezzar had a vision. He had a vision of an image that had a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet partly of clay and iron. Well, Daniel interpreted that dream for Nebuchadnezzar, and he tells us that that image represented certain world empires that must come before God's kingdom would be set up on earth. Daniel 2:44, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And Galatians 4:4, but when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, that that we might receive the adoption of sons. Why these four kingdoms? What did each of them have to prepare the way for God's kingdom? On the first slide, we'll see about Babylon. Babylon's where Israel was carried off into captivity. But they brought about synagogue worship. Up until then, that didn't exist. It was tabernacle worship. The next empire was Medo-Persia. The Persians brought with them, gave us the rule of law. The next empire that was mentioned is the Greek Empire. They gave us an international language that existed through much of the world so that everybody could speak the same way and understand each other when it was time to spread the gospel, when the kingdom did come. And the fourth empire, the Roman Empire, they gave us roads and shipping lanes so that we could travel much quicker and much easier. God's the one that came up with the plan and the timing. But He told us that there were certain things that would need to be made ready before He was going to introduce His kingdom into the world. Now, these aren't the only contributions each of these empires made, but they're probably some of the most significant that was directed at preparing the way for when God did establish His kingdom on the earth. It would make it easier for those Christians in the first century to obey their commandment to go and teach the world. Because it'd be kind of hard to go and teach somebody in another country when they speak another language, or when it'd take you 2 years to get there because you had to walk. Well, similarly, our founders were very intelligent and educated in world history, particularly its British history. They realized that there were certain events in our history, and I say our because we, as a nation, came out of a British colony. So we may call it British history, but in fact it's our history as well. That in order for us to be a people and to appreciate to be able to live under true liberty, just as we as Christians are individually accountable to God for our actions, our form of government is based on self-governance of ourselves. This is why it can only work in a moral society. They understood that God was and is the only true author and giver of liberty. They studied over 700 years of British history and looked at 5 historical documents, in addition to God's Word, that prepared the way for our American form of a constitutional republic. It was a form of government that had never existed on earth before, anywhere, ever. It did not come into existence by chance or accident. And our Constitution was not written in 1787. There's nothing new, nothing novel, nothing invented in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, or our Bill of Rights. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 1:9, "That which has been is what will be, that which is done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun." We've all heard the expression, if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it, right? Well, I've heard a better one. If we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat its mistakes. Because while history will always repeat, there's good stuff in history we don't mind repeating. What we don't want to repeat are the mistakes that were made in history. In a word, James Madison says, a man is said to have a right to his property and he may be equally said to have a property in his rights in 1792. Do you understand what that means? We can understand property rights. If you own a home or your property, your name is on a deed, that's yours. You can take out a piece of paper and say, hey, this property is mine. You can't just come in here and take it. But do you realize James Madison says you have the same rights or property ownership in your rights. It's not physical property, but your rights you have just as much claim to, even legally speaking. So in other words, we must regard and defend our rights just as we would our physical property. What would you say or do if a government agent came and said that they were going to reinterpret your property lines on your survey? They're going to have to take back 10 foot on each side of your land plot from you. They said, will you as a landowner give it back to them willingly? We have been taught to be passive whenever a government representative tells you something, no matter what it is. Yet we know we have a recognized right in the First Amendment for our freedom of speech. Then we hear a government representative tell us that certain words are against the law. We've been conditioned to accept those types of statements from our government agents without question, without thinking, and without defending our right to free speech. We blindly surrender our rights at the request of government. For example, we've been told it is illegal to say the word fire in a theater. We've been told that is an exception to the First Amendment. Is that true? No, it's not. What if the Supreme Court justices say so? Because they have. It's not true. The illegal act is only when your words cause an injury to another person. It doesn't have to be fire. It could be anything. But what they've conditioned us into is a type of thought police. Shh, don't say that, because I told you you can't. But our legal system was designed to punish incorrect action, not incorrect thought. Well, just by saying the word fire in a theater is not an incorrect action unless it causes injury to somebody else. What was the origin of an American liberty? John Adams, 1765, says, liberty must at all hazards be supported. We have a right to it, derived from our Maker. But if we had not, our fathers have earned and bought it for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. Our founders recognized natural law, that it comes from God because we are created in the image of God. We inherited it from God, just like Christians inherit a brotherhood with Christ when we obey the gospel. We did not, however, want to live in a place of complete freedom, because in such a place we would be free to lie, to cheat, to steal, and to murder. Liberty and freedom are not the same. Liberty is the freedom to do anything that you want, but your morality restrains you once you reach the point that you've infringed on somebody else's liberty. It means we will not lie, cheat, steal, or murder because it's morally wrong. How many of you think that laws stop crime? If so, we would live in a crime-free society because we have plenty of laws that make crime illegal. Did God's law stop sin? Liberty in our constitutional republic is based on certain principles that do not change based upon political affiliation. Liberty exists when we exercise our freedom only up to the point where it interferes with someone else's liberty. This is a founding godly principle upon which our entire form of government is supposed to be based upon. Our liberty has been paid for by those before us. We have to pay for the liberty of our children, not for us, because the liberty that we preserve, we don't preserve for us, we preserve for our posterity. But we no longer understand liberty, history, the Constitution, or the Bible as a nation. We run to the Supreme Court of the United States to answer all our questions. We ask the government to pass laws to legislate morality. We beg the government to take the role of the Holy Spirit and the church. We've come to expect from our government the very things that our founding fathers fought a war to free us from. As Christians, we are expected of God to be self-directed, to choose to follow Him. And as citizens of His greatest form of government on earth, we are expected of God to be self-governed. That is the difference between our constitutional republic and every other form of government that exists on earth. It was designed for a people who are morally mature enough to self-govern themselves. It can work for no other kind of people. If we knew how the Constitution was supposed to work, we wouldn't need as many laws as we have today. Christians would be more involved with the work of the church, the hedges, and the highways than having to lobby for morality in Washington, D.C. Our British history begins in the year 1014 AD. But I kind of let the cat out of the bag last week. Our Revolutionary War was not fought between Americans and Great Britain. It was fought between British citizens and their government, because that's all that was here then, British citizens. So it was not a civil war. It was not a war between two nations, but a war similar to what our American Civil War was. It was between the people and the government. But our British history starts in the year 1014 AD. Most of the history that I've ever heard of, and go to Washington, I've been twice with my children with the school trips. And you can go to the National Archives and see a lot of our founding documents. The farthest back that anybody I've ever heard goes back to was the Magna Carta. But you know, there was one other document before that, one other event, that if it had never happened, we wouldn't have the Magna Carta. It was during this time the Anglo-Saxons lived in small communities in Great Britain. At the time, they had no king, no central government. They had previously, but during this time period they didn't. Just neighborhoods getting along with each other. They were very prosperous in this way of life. But the neighboring kingdoms took notice of them, what was going on. And they wanted to take over. They had the mindset, they don't have a king. Maybe they need one. Well, the problems was there's no texting, no Twitter, no internet back then for them to be able to call for help or organize for a common defense. They had no way to communicate to prosper for their general welfare either. You notice the terms I used in the last two statements? So, they went to a man named Ethelred and said, your family has been king over the Anglo-Saxons before. when we used to have king. So we want you to be a king now, but with one condition. Your only job will be to communicate with foreign kings for treaties, for peace negotiations, to help organize ourselves for our common defense. You will leave us alone in our communities, in our own small communities and towns. We will govern ourselves. Now, if you'd been taught the Constitution the way it should have been for the last 100 years, you would have bells going off in your head right now when I use those terms. You'd realize that that was the exact same agreement the states made when they created the federal government that exists in Washington, D.C. So James Madison in Federalist Papers 45, which those are papers during the time period when they were debating our Constitution, what to make, what to put in it, what to leave out. Because it didn't occur overnight. It took quite a while. Well, a lot of our founders that was involved in that, this is similar to what would be an article written for a local newspaper. So they wrote articles and published them, explaining their thought processes of why they were doing this or that or arguing about this and that when trying to come up with the best constitution that they could. He said, the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. And that those powers delegated to the federal government were to be used on external objects. That was how they referred to then as foreign affairs. Then he names what those powers are for us. So we did not have to wait for the Supreme Court to do so for us. He states them outright as war, peace, negotiations, and foreign commerce. So those were the only powers. Well, King Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun, and human nature never changes. So something happens when you start calling someone a king. They start acting like one. So remember in 1 Samuel chapter 8 where Israel demands the prophet Samuel to give them a king like the other nations. Well, what was God's warning? And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So when the people start looking to the king to be their provider, don't be surprised when they start acting like subjects of a king. So Edward becomes known as the generous king. But I got a question for you. When they made Ethelred king, they had one specific condition. Do you remember anywhere in that agreement where the king was given the authority to be generous? Is that war, peace, negotiations, or commerce? So Edward becomes known as the generous king. They liked free stuff. Unfortunately for them though, he is about to die and he has no son to rule after him. Well, kings believe that they rule by divine right. Sound familiar about anybody else in our political spectrum today? So that they have gotten used to the idea of a king that provides for them. So they become concerned about who will take over the throne when he's gone. When you don't have a direct heir to the throne, there's always a long list of cousins that you have to go through for who will be next in line. The first in line is William, but they don't want him to be king because he's a Norman and not an Anglo-Saxon. For some reason, they just did not want a foreign leader to rule over their country. Would you? So a foreign king brings foreign policies and foreign law with him when he comes. Norman kings do not rule like Anglo-Saxon kings. Anglo-Saxon kings are limited in their power. Norman kings are not. So there are any bells going off in your heads about the difference? Maybe we have been electing Norman representatives to each of our levels of government instead of Anglo-Saxon ones. So the Anglo-Saxons hatch out a plan to appoint a guy named Harold as king, because he was a close advisor to the prior king. The problem is the year is 1066 and we're not yet appointing kings. We're not electing kings either. Well, William hears about them trying to pass him over as king and gets just a little bit upset. The bad news for the Anglo-Saxon is that William has a nickname. He's known as William the Conqueror. William, he raises up his Norman army, he conquers Harold, and places himself on the throne. But now William gets a surprise. He was wanting to rule as a Norman king, but the people are used to a limited power king, a limited kingship. Well, kings have the power to write decrees which are binding on the people. He could write a decree and declare that he will rule as a Norman king against their wishes. He knows that when the people are unhappy, though, with their king, they do not start a recall petition to remove him. They don't find someone else to run against him in the next kingly election. They cut off his head in rebellion. Well, he likes his head. So instead, he decides to fundamentally transform the kingdom in such a way that the people would not notice the transformation. So he had to get rid of the common law, which was the limiting factor on the king. So he starts replacing judges with people who are not loyal to the common law, i.e., activist judges. But they're loyal to the ideology of the king or party. They begin enforcing Norman law on them even when it is contrary to their common law. Maybe they were not constitutionally minded judges. So he starts chasing landowners off their land, and some of them even out of the country. Maybe they had a protected species on the property that needed protecting, was his excuse. Now the abandoned land reverts back to the king. Well, now I have all this land that belongs to me. What am I going to do with it? So he invites his Norman friends and foreigners. I guess they're not connected, so it couldn't be Central Americans, to come and move in and live here. Now you can easily keep foreign law in your kingdom now because there's more people that want the foreign law than there is that want the common law, because they like it better than the law of the land. So he also replaces leaders in the churches with men loyal to the work, replaces the men in the churches with men not loyal to the word of God, but to the king. Now he has control of the church and demands people to do things contrary to the word of God. Perhaps things like abortion. This transformation takes about 40 years through the reign of William I and William II. So William II reigns for about 13 years. He was known as an evil king like his father, and his nickname was William the Red. I wonder why. Well, one day, William and his brother Henry goes on a hunting trip. Well, William the Conqueror actually had 4 sons. The first son and him did not get along at all. In fact, his first son tried to have him killed. Well, That's not good for family relations when your son tries to have you killed. So you can imagine that didn't go well. Well, he runs off to the Holy Land to fight in the Crusades. The second son had no interest whatsoever in being king. So the third son, which was William II, reigns for about 13 years. Well, since becoming king is a divine right that's passed down through based on what order you're born in. So let's say you're the fourth son in a family. You don't have a whole lot of chance of becoming king unless something happens to the brothers in front of you. Well, one day, William and Henry goes hunting on a hunting trip. And they have, of course, their own hunting parties with them. Well, there happens to be an accident. Somehow, William is shot by a stray arrow from somebody in Henry's hunting party. Accidentally hits him right in the eye and kills him. So, that accident catapults Henry right into the kingship. So, we now have Henry I as king. So, how many of you believe that was an accident? Well, the people then did not either. They didn't trust him. If he was willing to kill his brother, even though they hated his brother as king, what were the people to him? So one thing William does to appease the people is he writes the first document in our Tree of Liberty. It's called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. And in it, he promises that kings will never, ever be evil or oppressive again. How do you think that works out for the people? There's actually 14 promises made in the 1100 Charter of Liberties. But unfortunately, we're out of time today, so I'll pick it up next week. Thank you.